The autumn wind howled through the dusty streets of Deadwood, South Dakota, carrying with it whispers of fortune and misfortune that would forever change the life of Jake Morrison. The year was 1876, and the frontier town pulsed with the desperate energy of gold seekers and gamblers who had staked everything on dreams as fragile as morning frost. Jake pushed through the saloon doors of the Silver Dollar, his weathered boots echoing against warped wooden floors stained with decades of spilled whiskey and blood. Tonight, he carried his last $20 and a heart heavy with the weight of 3 months' worth of empty pockets. Little did he know that within the next hour, he would become the reluctant owner of a property that would test every ounce of courage he possessed. The dice were already rolling across the felt-covered table in the corner, and Death himself seemed to be keeping score. Jake's calloused hands trembled slightly as he approached the poker table where old Pete Garrison sat hunched over his cards like a vulture guarding carrion. Pete's reputation preceded him throughout the Dakota Territory, a man who had won and lost more fortunes than most could count. His gray beard stained yellow from decades of tobacco juice and bitter disappointment. The stakes tonight were higher than usual. Jake could sense it in the thick smoke that hung in the air like a funeral shroud. "Morrison?" Pete croaked, his voice like gravel grinding beneath wagon wheels. "Heard you been having a string of bad luck." Jake nodded grimly, knowing that news of his misfortune had spread through Deadwood faster than wildfire through dry grass. "Got something that might interest a desperate man like yourself," Pete continued, producing a yellow deed from his worn leather coat. "Little shack up on Pine Ridge, about 15 miles north of here." The deed felt ancient between Jake's fingers, its edges cracked and brittle like autumn leaves. Pine Ridge had a reputation among the locals, though nobody seemed willing to talk about exactly why the area made even the most hardened miners and trappers nervous. "What's the catch, Pete?" Jake asked, studying the old man's rheumy eyes for any hint of deception. Pete's laugh was dry as desert sand. "No catch, boy. Just a simple game of dice. You win, the shack is yours, deed and clear. You lose, well..." He gestured toward Jake's modest pile of coins. "I take what little you got left." The other men at surrounding tables had grown quiet, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Jake felt the weight of their stares pressing against his shoulders like invisible hands. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, though no rain had been predicted. The first hook had been set, and Jake Morrison was about to discover that some prizes come with a price far higher than money. The dice felt cold in Jake's palm, almost unnaturally so despite the warmth of the crowded saloon. Pete's eyes glittered with an intensity that made Jake's skin crawl, but desperation had driven him beyond the point of rational caution. "Best 2 out of 3, Pete declared, his voice carrying an odd finality. The first roll clattered across the table, settling on snake eyes. Jake's heart sank, but Pete merely smiled and gathered the dice for his turn. 7. The old man's luck held strong. The second round proved more favorable for Jake, his dice showing a perfect 12, while Pete managed only 8. 1-1, everything hanging in the balance. The saloon had grown so quiet that Jake could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. As he picked up the dice for the final roll, a strange sensation washed over him, as if invisible fingers were guiding his hand. The dice tumbled and spun, finally coming to rest. 11. Pete's face went ashen as his own final throw revealed a measly 5. "Congratulations, Morrison," Pete said, though his voice carried no warmth of genuine good wishes. "The shack is yours." He slid the deed across the table with movements that seemed almost reluctant, as if parting with the document caused him physical pain. Jake studied the old man's expression, noting how Pete's hands shook slightly as he released his grip on the yellowed paper. "Mighty generous of you to put up property against such small stakes," Jake observed suspiciously. Pete's laugh was bitter and strange. "Sometimes a man needs to pass certain burdens along to someone else, boy. Sometimes holding on to something too long can eat a man alive from the inside out." The ominous words hung in the smoky air like a curse. Jake pocketed the deed and his remaining coins, nodding his thanks to Pete, who had already turned away and begun ordering whiskey by the bottle. As Jake pushed through the saloon doors into the cold night air, he couldn't shake the feeling that Pete Garrison looked relieved, almost grateful to be rid of his property. The ride to Pine Ridge took Jake through some of the most desolate country he had ever encountered. The trail wound through stands of twisted pine trees that seemed to lean inward like arthritic fingers, casting long shadows that moved independently of the wind. His horse, a sturdy mare named Belle, grew increasingly skittish as they climbed higher into the hills, her ears constantly swiveling toward sounds that Jake couldn't identify. The landscape here felt different somehow, older and more watchful than the country around Deadwood. Ancient rock formations jutted from the earth like broken teeth, and more than once Jake thought he glimpsed movement in his peripheral vision, only to turn and find nothing but empty wilderness. By late afternoon, he crested a small rise and saw his new property spread out below him in a narrow valley. The shack was smaller than he had expected, built from weathered logs that had gone gray with age, its single chimney releasing no welcoming smoke into the crisp autumn air. As Jake approached the dwelling, he noticed details that Pete had failed to mention. Children's toys lay scattered around the property, old and weathered but still recognizable. A wooden rocking horse, its paint long since faded to bare wood. A collection of small stones arranged in what might have been a child's game. Most unsettling of all, a child-sized rocking chair sat on the small front porch, moving gently back and forth in the breeze despite the absence of any wind strong enough to cause such motion. Belle whinnied nervously and refused to approach closer than 20 yards from the cabin, forcing Jake to dismount and continue on foot. The front door stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond the threshold. Jake pushed it open slowly, his hand resting instinctively on the grip of his Colt revolver. The interior was surprisingly clean and well-maintained, furnished with simple but sturdy pieces that suggested recent habitation. A thin layer of dust covered everything, but not the thick accumulation one would expect from an abandoned dwelling. Night fell quickly in the mountains, and Jake spent his first evening in the shack trying to ignore the strange sounds that seemed to emanate from the surrounding forest. At first, he attributed the noises to natural causes: wind through the trees, small animals moving through the underbrush, the settling of old wood in the cooling air. But as the hours passed and the sounds grew more distinct, Jake began to recognize patterns that defied easy explanation. Footsteps seemed to circle the cabin, light and quick like those of running children. Occasionally, he thought he heard whispered conversations in voices too young and too faint to understand clearly. Each time he stepped onto the porch to investigate, the sounds would cease immediately, leaving only the oppressive silence of the mountain night. Jake checked his pocket watch repeatedly, noting how slowly the hours seemed to crawl toward midnight. The temperature inside the cabin remained comfortable despite the lack of a fire, another oddity that added to his growing unease about his new property and the circumstances of its acquisition. At exactly 11:45, Jake heard the first unmistakable sound of children's laughter. It began as a distant giggling, barely audible above the whisper of wind through pine boughs, but gradually grew closer and more distinct. 3 voices, he determined, 2 girls and 1 boy, their laughter bright and innocent yet somehow filled with an undertone of profound sadness. Jake pressed his ear against the window, trying to pinpoint the source of the sounds, but the laughter seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. His rational mind offered explanations: the echo effects of mountain terrain, auditory hallucinations brought on by stress and isolation, perhaps other settlers' children playing despite the late hour. But deep in his gut, Jake knew he was experiencing something that transcended normal understanding. The laughter continued for exactly 15 minutes, then stopped abruptly as if someone had closed a door. In the sudden silence, Jake became aware of his own rapid breathing and the thundering of his heart. Whatever was happening at his new home, it was only beginning. The second hook came at precisely midnight when Jake heard small hands knocking gently against his door. 3 soft taps, followed by a pause, then 3 more. The pattern repeated exactly 7 times before stopping. Jake approached the door cautiously, his revolver drawn and ready, though he wondered what earthly good bullets would do against whatever entities might be visiting him. Through the gap beneath the door, he could see shadows moving back and forth, small shapes that blocked the moonlight in ways that suggested the presence of actual physical beings. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice hoarse with tension. The response came in the form of children's voices, speaking in unison with unnatural clarity. "We want to come home, mister. We want to come inside where it's warm." Jake's blood ran cold. The voices carried the distinctive accent of the region, but something about their cadence and inflection seemed wrong, as if the speakers were repeating words they didn't fully understand. "This is my house now," Jake replied, though his voice shook with uncertainty. "You children need to go back to your own homes." "This is our home," came the reply, spoken with such conviction and sadness that Jake felt his resolve beginning to crumble. "We lived here with Mama and Papa before the bad men came." The knocking resumed, more insistent now, and Jake could hear additional sounds suggesting the presence of more than just 3 children. Footsteps moved around the perimeter of the cabin, and small voices whispered to each other in urgent, worried tones. Against his better judgment, Jake found himself reaching for the door handle. Something about the children's pleas tugged at his heart, despite the supernatural circumstances of their visit. But as his fingers touched the cold metal of the latch, every instinct he possessed screamed warnings at him. These were not living children seeking shelter from the cold mountain night. The realization hit him with the force of physical blow. Whatever was outside his door represented something far more dangerous than homeless youngsters. Jake jerked his hand away from the latch and stepped backward, his gun trained on the door as if wooden planks could protect him from forces beyond mortal understanding. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound that chilled Jake to his very soul. Crying. Not the ordinary tears of disappointed children, but a collective wailing filled with such grief and despair that Jake felt moisture gathering in his own eyes despite his terror. The sound seemed to seep through the walls of the cabin, filling every corner with lamentation that spoke of unbearable loss and endless longing. Through the window, Jake glimpsed shapes moving in the moonlight, translucent figures of 3 young children holding hands and staring directly at him with eyes that reflected light like those of nocturnal animals. The eldest appeared to be a girl of perhaps 10 years, flanked by a younger girl and a small boy who could not have been more than 5 or 6 years old. Their clothing was old-fashioned even by frontier standards, and their faces bore expressions of such profound sadness that Jake had to look away. When he forced himself to look again moments later, they had vanished, leaving only the echo of their crying and the certainty that his life had just taken a turn toward something beyond his comprehension or control. Dawn brought no relief from the previous night's supernatural encounter. As pale sunlight filtered through the cabin's dusty windows, Jake discovered evidence that his midnight visitors had left behind tangible proof of their presence. Small handprints covered the exterior of every window, pressed against the glass from outside with such force that the impressions remained clearly visible in the morning condensation. More disturbing still, Jake found children's drawings scattered around the cabin's foundation, crude stick figures depicting a family of 5 standing before a house that unmistakably represented his new property. The drawings appeared to have been made with charcoal or burnt wood, and despite being exposed to the mountain weather, they showed no signs of deterioration or fading. In each drawing, 3 small figures stood apart from 2 larger ones, and dark scribbles covered the larger figures, as if someone had tried to erase them from existence. Jake gathered the drawings with trembling hands, noting how the paper felt abnormally cold despite the warming morning air. Each sheet seemed to pull heat from his fingers, leaving them numb and stiff. Determined to understand what had befallen his new property, Jake rode into the nearest settlement, a tiny community called Millbrook located about 8 miles southeast of Pine Ridge. The town consisted of little more than a general store, a blacksmith shop, and a handful of rough cabins housing miners and trappers who worked the surrounding territory. The store's proprietor, a grizzled man named Samuel Creek, greeted Jake with the wary friendliness typical of frontier merchants encountering unfamiliar customers. "New in these parts?" Creek asked, noting Jake's travel-stained appearance and the haunted look in his eyes that seemed to have developed overnight. "Just acquired some property up on Pine Ridge," Jake replied, watching Creek's expression carefully for any reaction. The change was immediate and unmistakable. Creek's welcoming smile faded, replaced by a look of concern tinged with something that might have been pity. "The old Henderson place," Creek said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Heard Pete Garrison finally found someone to take that burden off his hands." You got my sympathy, stranger. You're gonna need it. Creek glanced around his empty store, then motioned for Jake to follow him toward the back room where they could speak privately. Name's Samuel Creek. Been running this place for nigh on 15 years now, he began, his voice low and serious. Seen plenty of strange things in that time, but nothing quite like what happened up at the Henderson property. Jake leaned forward eagerly, hungry for any information that might explain his midnight visitors. What happened to the Henderson family? He asked. Creek's weathered face grew grave. Tom Henderson brought his wife Martha and their 3 young ones out here in the spring of '74, built that cabin with his own hands. Good folks, hard-working and God-fearing. The children, Sarah, Mary, and little Timothy, they were the light of their parents' lives. Creek paused, running his fingers through his gray beard as if the telling of the story caused him physical discomfort. Come that winter, things started going wrong. Bad wrong. Jake felt his stomach tighten with anticipation and dread, sensing that he was about to learn something that would change his understanding of the situation entirely. Started with livestock disappearing, Creek continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Chickens, goats, even their milk cow vanished without a trace. No signs of predator attacks, no blood, nothing to suggest what might have taken them. Then supplies started running low despite Tom's careful preparations for winter. Food would spoil overnight, while water would turn brackish for no apparent reason. Firewood that should have lasted months burned through in days as if the very wood was cursed to provide no real warmth. Jake listened intently, noting how Creek's hands shook slightly as he recounted the events. Tom made several trips down here to the store, buying supplies and asking questions about whether anyone else in the area was experiencing similar problems. He looked more haggard each time I saw him, like something was eating away at him from the inside. Martha stopped coming to town altogether, and when folks asked after her, Tom would just say she was tending to the children and change the subject real quick like. The last time I saw Tom Henderson alive was 3 days before Christmas, 1874, Creek continued, his voice growing even more subdued. He came staggering into my store looking like he hadn't slept in weeks. His clothes were torn and dirty, his eyes wild with something that went beyond ordinary fear. He kept looking over his shoulder like he expected something terrible to come bursting through my front door at any moment. Creek paused to pour himself a shot of whiskey from a bottle he kept beneath the counter, downing it in one quick gulp before continuing. Tom told me that something had been visiting his family every night for the past 2 weeks. Something that wanted his children, that whispered to them through the walls and tried to lure them outside into the cold and snow. He said Martha had taken to sleeping with the little ones, trying to keep them calm and safe, but that whatever was after them was getting stronger, more persistent, more difficult to resist. Jake felt his blood turn to ice water as Creek's words painted a picture of supernatural harassment that echoed his own recent experiences far too closely for comfort. Tom bought enough supplies to last his family through the remainder of winter, plus ammunition, salt, iron nails, and anything else I had that folks claimed might ward off evil spirits, Creek continued. He paid with gold dust, more than the supplies were worth, and told me to keep the change in case his family needed credit later on. That was the last transaction Tom Henderson ever made. Creek's voice took on the hollow tone of a man recounting his worst nightmares. 3 days later, smoke stopped rising from their chimney. Folks noticed but figured maybe they were just conserving wood or had gone to visit relatives for the holiday. Wasn't until after New Year's that anyone got concerned enough to make the ride up Pine Ridge to check on them. Jake gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles white with tension. When the search party reached the cabin, they found it locked up tight from the inside. Had to break down the door to get in. What they discovered, Creek shook his head sadly, still gives me nightmares, and I wasn't even there to see it firsthand. Tom and Martha were found in their bed, apparently died peaceful in their sleep despite everything they'd been through, Creek revealed, his voice heavy with sorrow and confusion. No signs of violence, no indication of what might have caused their deaths. Doc Wilson came up from Rapid City to examine the bodies, said it looked like their hearts just stopped beating simultaneously, which he claimed was medically impossible but couldn't explain any other way. Jake waited for Creek to continue, sensing that the most disturbing part of the story was yet to come. "The children were missing," Creek said simply, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. Sarah, Mary, and little Timothy were nowhere to be found. Search parties combed every inch of that property and the surrounding wilderness for weeks, following every possible trail, checking every cave and hiding spot within a 50-mile radius. Never found so much as a scrap of their clothing or a single footprint to indicate where they might have gone. It was like they just vanished into thin air, leaving their parents dead and the whole community wondering what kind of evil had visited Pine Ridge. "That's when the real trouble started," Creek continued ominously. "Whoever bought the Henderson place, or even just stayed there overnight, would report the same phenomena. Children's voices calling out in the darkness, small hands knocking on doors and windows, toys appearing and disappearing, furniture moving by itself. Most folks lasted no more than a single night before packing up and leaving, swearing never to return." Jake thought about Pete Garrison's obvious relief at losing the property in their dice game, understanding now why the old gambler had been so eager to pass ownership to someone else. "Pete Garrison owned the place for nearly 2 years, Creek explained. "Bought it cheap from the territorial government when no living relatives came forward to claim the estate. Pete figured he could fix it up and sell it for a profit, but he never spent more than a few hours there at a time. Said the place felt wrong, like it was waiting for something or someone that wasn't ever going to come." Creek fixed Jake with a steady gaze. "Now it seems that something might be you, stranger. Question is, what do you plan to do about it?" Jake left Millbrook with his mind reeling from Creek's revelations and his saddlebags loaded with supplies the storekeeper had insisted he take. Salt, iron filings, blessed candles from the small church in Rapid City, and a leather pouch containing what Creek claimed were genuine Apache protective charms obtained through years of trading with tribal shamans. "Might not do any good," Creek had warned, "but it sure can't hurt to have them on hand." The ride back to Pine Ridge felt longer than usual, perhaps because Jake now understood exactly what awaited him at his destination. The children he had encountered were Sarah, Mary, and Timothy Henderson, trapped somehow between life and death, unable to move on to whatever came after mortality. Their parents were gone. Their earthly home now belonged to a stranger, and their innocent spirits were apparently doomed to wander the property where they had once played and laughed and dreamed of growing up. Jake found himself wondering if the children's nightly visits were motivated by malevolence or simply by the desperate longing of lost souls seeking comfort and familiarity in an existence they no longer understood. As evening approached, Jake made careful preparations for his second night in the Henderson cabin. He sprinkled lines of salt across every threshold and windowsill, hammered iron nails into the door frame at eye level, and placed the blessed candles at strategic points throughout the single room. The Apache charms went into his shirt pocket, close to his heart, though he had little faith in their protective power against forces he barely comprehended. Outside, twilight settled over Pine Ridge like a purple shroud, and Jake could already sense the familiar stirring of supernatural activity beginning to build around his property. The temperature inside the cabin dropped noticeably despite his efforts to maintain a warm fire, and shadows seemed to move independently of their sources, gathering in corners and along walls with purposeful intent. Jake cleaned and loaded his revolver, knowing full well that bullets would be useless against his expected visitors, but finding comfort in the familiar ritual of weapon maintenance. At exactly 10:30, he heard the first whispered voices of the Henderson children calling his name from somewhere in the surrounding darkness. "Mr. Jake," came Sarah's voice, clearer and more distinct than the previous night. "Why did you put salt on our windows? Salt hurts us when we try to come home." Jake's heart clenched at the pain in the young girl's words, but he forced himself to remain rational. These were not living children seeking shelter. They were supernatural entities whose true intentions remained unknown despite their apparent innocence. "We miss Mama and Papa," added Mary's voice, thick with tears that would never fall. "Can you help us find them? Can you help us go where they went?" Little Timothy's voice joined the chorus, barely more than a whisper carried on the mountain wind. "We're cold, mister. We've been cold for so long." The bad things took our warm away and left us in the dark place. Jake approached the window cautiously, peering out through glass that had already begun to fog with mysterious condensation despite the lack of moisture in the air. 3 small figures stood in the moonlight, their faces upturned toward his window with expressions of such profound hope and desperation that Jake felt his protective resolve beginning to waver dangerously. Against every instinct screaming warnings in his mind, Jake found himself reaching for the door latch. The children's pleas had awakened something paternal in his heart, a desperate need to comfort and protect innocents who had suffered unimaginable loss and trauma. His hand touched the cold metal of the latch, and immediately the knocking began, gentle but insistent, accompanied by Sarah's voice pleading for entrance. "Please, Mr. Jake, we just want to be warm again. We want to sit by your fire and remember what it felt like to be alive." Jake's fingers tightened on the latch, his rational mind battling with emotional impulses he couldn't fully control. But as he began to turn the handle, something Creek had said earlier echoed through his consciousness with the force of a physical blow. These children had been missing for over 2 years. Their bodies never found, their fate never determined. What if they weren't actually dead but trapped somewhere between life and death, sustained by some malevolent force that used their innocence as bait for unsuspecting victims? Jake jerked his hand away from the door as if the metal had burned him, stepping backward into the protection of his salt barriers. The moment Jake withdrew from the door, the atmosphere around the cabin changed dramatically. The gentle pleading of the children's voices transformed into something far more sinister, their words becoming distorted and threatening despite maintaining their youthful timbre. "You can't keep us out forever, mister," Sarah's voice declared, though it now carried undertones of malice that made Jake's skin crawl. "We know you want to help us. We can feel your heart calling to ours." The knocking intensified, becoming a violent pounding that seemed to shake the entire structure of the small cabin. Outside, Jake could hear sounds of destruction as unseen forces tore at his property, overturning furniture, destroying the few possessions he had brought with him, venting supernatural rage against his refusal to grant them entrance. The blessed candles flickered wildly despite the absence of any breeze, their flames dancing in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if the very air around them was being manipulated by invisible hands. Through the window, Jake watched in horrified fascination as the 3 children's forms began to change, becoming translucent and distorted, their innocent faces twisting into expressions of hunger and predatory intelligence. For exactly 1 hour, the supernatural assault continued with increasing intensity. Jake huddled in the center of his salt circle, clutching his useless revolver and praying to whatever divine powers might be listening for protection against forces beyond mortal understanding. The cabin groaned and creaked under the onslaught, its ancient logs straining against pressures that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously. At the height of the attack, Jake heard new voices joining the children's chorus, adult voices he recognized from Creek's description as belonging to Tom and Martha Henderson. But where the children's voices carried malice and supernatural hunger, the parents' voices seemed filled with warning and desperation. "Don't listen to them," Martha's voice pleaded through the chaos. "They're not our children anymore. Something took our babies and left these things in their place. Don't let them in. Don't give them what they want, or you'll join us in this endless darkness." Tom's voice added urgency to his wife's warning. "Run, stranger. Run while you still can. This place is cursed, and anyone who stays too long becomes part of the curse. Save yourself before it's too late." As suddenly as it had begun, the supernatural storm ceased, leaving Jake alone in a cabin that felt somehow smaller and more fragile than it had before the attack. The salt lines remained intact, the iron nails still gleamed in their positions, and the blessed candles continued to burn with steady flames that seemed to push back the encroaching darkness. But Jake knew with absolute certainty that his protective measures were temporary at best, that whatever forces controlled the Henderson children would return with renewed strength and determination. The warnings from Tom and Martha Henderson echoed in his memory, urging him to flee before the curse that had claimed their family could claim him as well. Yet something deeper than mere curiosity kept Jake rooted to the spot, a growing understanding that running away would solve nothing and might condemn other innocent people to face the same supernatural harassment. Whatever had happened to the Henderson family, whatever malevolent force had claimed their children and trapped their souls in eternal torment, it needed to be confronted and resolved rather than simply avoided. Jake made a decision that would either save or damn him. He would stay and fight for the freedom of 5 souls trapped in supernatural bondage. The third night brought Jake's greatest challenge yet as the entities that had once been the Henderson family launched their most sophisticated attack. This time, they didn't rely solely on supernatural terror and physical intimidation. Instead, they began weaving an elaborate psychological trap designed to exploit Jake's growing emotional attachment to their tragic story. Sarah's voice, restored to its original innocence and vulnerability, spoke to him through the cabin walls with heartbreaking clarity. "Mr. Jake, we remember now. We remember what happened to us. The bad things that took us away, they're still out there in the darkness. They're hungry, and they're looking for someone new to feed on. We're trying to protect you, but we need to come inside where we can keep you safe." The story the children told was compelling and detailed, filled with specific information about supernatural predators that hunted the mountain wilderness, entities that fed on human fear and despair. According to Sarah, she and her siblings had been chosen as guardians, blessed with the power to protect innocent people from these demonic forces, but only if they were invited into dwellings by their intended protectees. Jake found himself wavering under the persuasive power of the children's new narrative, his rational mind struggling against emotional manipulation that seemed designed specifically to target his psychological weaknesses. The story explained everything: the mysterious deaths of Tom and Martha Henderson, the supernatural phenomena plaguing the property, even the previous tenants' hasty departures. If the children were indeed protective spirits rather than malevolent entities, then his refusal to grant them entrance was not only cruel but potentially suicidal. Outside, the sounds of approaching danger grew steadily louder, inhuman howls and growls that seemed to emanate from creatures far more terrifying than 3 lost children seeking shelter. "Hurry, Mr. Jake," Timothy's voice urged with increasing panic. "They're almost here. We can smell their hunger on the wind. Please let us in so we can save you like we couldn't save Mama and Papa." Jake's hand moved toward the door latch despite every instinct warning him against such action. The approaching sounds grew closer, more menacing, filled with such malevolent hunger that Jake's blood turned to ice water in his veins. But as Jake's fingers touched the cold metal of the latch for the 3rd time, a memory surfaced from the depths of his consciousness. Something Creek had mentioned in passing that suddenly took on crucial importance. The storekeeper had said that Tom and Martha Henderson had been found in their bed, apparently having died peacefully in their sleep. If supernatural predators had been stalking the family, if demonic forces had been hunting them through the winter nights, then why had the parents shown no signs of violence or struggle? Why had they died quietly in their bed while their children vanished without a trace? The inconsistency in the story broke through Jake's emotional confusion like sunlight-piercing storm clouds, revealing the psychological trap that had been laid for him with such skillful precision. The approaching sounds of demonic predators were illusions. The children's protective narrative was a lie designed to trick him into opening his door and inviting the real threats inside. Jake jerked his hand away from the latch and stepped backward, his mind clear for the first time since the psychological assault had begun. "I know what you are now," he declared aloud, his voice strong with newfound determination and understanding. The story continues. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter.